actually flirted with Nikki to you. And I know she does.
I'm gonna go get some shots.
I'll come with you if she needs.
Hi.
Good night. What else? Hey, Nikki, I think we should grab a drink.
Super dating.
So she's just a wish.
I'm sorry.
In the ever-evolving landscape of contemporary horror cinema, some films consciously engage with the present moment, deliberately crafting narratives that speak to current cultural anxieties. Others function more like lightning rods, pulling in ambient bursts of cultural electricity and channeling them into films that crackle with the raw, unfiltered energy of their times. With Obsession, Curry Barker has made one of the latter, a film that doesn't just reflect our current moment but captures it with an almost unsettling precision. The 26-year-old former YouTuber's second feature film distills the ambient gender-based resentment of 2020's internet culture into a horror film that could be described as an EC Comics-style pulp morality tale, if the director knew what that was. This generational disconnect is part of what makes Obsession so fascinating. Barker has created something that resonates with the moral clarity of classic horror comics without necessarily being influenced by them, suggesting that certain archetypal stories about consequences and moral failures transcend generational boundaries and emerge organically from the cultural zeitgeist. Setting up The Monkey's Paw. The film's protagonist, Bear Michael Johnston, short for Baron, a detail that immediately signals his parents' pretensions and perhaps his own inflated sense of self-importance, is a typical, nice guy, in the most loaded sense of that term. He's timid and assiduous about not revealing his massive crush on Nikki, Inde Navarrette, his childhood friend and current co-worker at a family-owned music store. The setting itself is significant. These dusty repositories of analog culture have become spaces where young people who don't quite fit into the digital mainstream congregate, creating found families and nursing unrequited attractions in equal measure. Bear knows that telling Nikki how he really feels will probably ruin their relationship and make things weird with their mutual friends, Ian Cooper Tomlinson, and Sarah Megan Lawless, as well. This friend group dynamic, the quartet of young people navigating romance, friendship, and the transition to adulthood, is familiar territory for horror films, from Scream to It Follows. Still, the heart wants what the heart wants, and although Ian warns him not to ruin their weekly trivia night by confessing his love, Bear can't keep it in much longer. This setup is all relatively innocent and relatable on the surface. Who hasn't harbored an unrequited crush? Who hasn't wrestled with the question of whether to confess feelings that might destroy a valued friendship? Barker's genius lies in how he uses this universal experience as a Trojan horse for exploring much darker territory about entitlement, objectification, and the violence inherent in viewing another person as the solution to your problems rather than as a complete human being with their own autonomy and desires. When wishes come true and shouldn't. It's what happens after Bear gets his wish that makes Obsession such a thorny and unsettling watch. Barker's film is cruel and unforgiving towards its characters, snaring them in diabolical traps and then observing them as they spiral out under the pressure. This approach places Obsession firmly in the tradition of supernatural punishment narratives, from The Monkey's Paw to more recent films like Wish Upon, but with a specifically gendered critique that gives the familiar formula new resonance. In Bear's case, the malignant nature of his obsession with Nikki begins to reveal itself almost immediately, as the intelligent, sarcastic young woman he knows, or thinks he knows, is replaced by a volatile doppelganger after Bear, in what he perceives as an innocent moment, wishes for her to love him more than anything in the world, on a novelty toy he picks up at a gift shop early on in the film. The choice of a gift shop trinket as the supernatural catalyst is particularly inspired. These mass-produced objects promising luck or wish fulfillment are the consumer capitalism version of ancient talismans, making magic mundane and accessible, yet no less dangerous for their availability. The new Nikki is clearly not okay from the moment she appears. Her eyes are glazed, her speech is halting, her behavior is manic and disturbing, and she occasionally jolts and starts screaming as if she's just woken up from a terrible nightmare. And that's before she starts committing acts of horrific violence against both herself and others. The physical manifestations of her possession are both supernatural horror and disturbingly realistic depictions of severe psychological distress, creating an uncomfortable ambiguity about whether we're watching demonic possession or a mental health crisis, or whether, in the film's universe, there's any meaningful difference. Bear's moral descent, a portrait of entitled masculinity. The selfishness of nice guys. What makes Obsession so effective as both horror and social commentary is how it refuses to let its protagonist off the hook. This new Nicky is in love with Bear, giving him exactly what he thought he wanted, and so he selfishly chooses to stay with her even after learning that the original Nicky is suffering in hell while her double is cuddling with him. This revelation, that his romantic fantasy is literally built on her eternal torment, should be the moment of moral clarity that sends Bear scrambling to reverse his wish. Instead, he hesitates, rationalizes, and ultimately continues to benefit from a situation he knows is causing someone he claims to love unspeakable suffering. Until the very end of the movie, Bear's decision-making is craven and contemptible, earning his punishment from the unseen, yet inescapable forces that are now in control of his fate. This sustained character study of moral cowardice is rare in horror films, which often allow protagonists some redemptive arc or moment of heroism. Barker denies us, and Bear, this comfort. The film becomes an extended interrogation of what it means when someone claims to love you but consistently chooses their comfort over your well-being, their fantasy over your reality. The nice guy phenomenon, widely discussed in feminist circles and across social media, finds perhaps its most devastating cinematic expression in Bear's character. He doesn't consider himself a bad person. He's not overtly aggressive or threatening in the way of traditional movie villains. He simply believes, on some fundamental level, that his feelings entitle him to Nicky's reciprocation, and when given the opportunity to have her, even in this grotesque, violated form, he takes it. The horror of Obsession isn't just supernatural, it's the horror of recognizing how easily ordinary selfishness can shade into something monstrous when given the opportunity. Collateral damage. When innocents suffer. People who don't deserve it are tortured as well, part of Barker's Ari Aster-influenced taste for emotional violence towards both the characters and the audience. This comparison to Aster, the director behind Hereditary and Midsommar, is apt, as both filmmakers share a willingness to put their characters, and by extension, their viewers, through sustained psychological torment. However, while Aster's films often explore how communities and families become sites of horror, Barker focuses more narrowly on how individual selfishness creates expanding circles of suffering. The film is full of grotesque imagery, cat lovers beware, there are scenes that will have you rushing home to check on your pet as soon as the movie ends, and shocking, brutal violence. The inclusion of animal violence is controversial and will undoubtedly be a deal-breaker for some viewers, but it serves a thematic purpose beyond mere shock value. In horror's symbolic language, the killing of pets often represents the violation of domestic safety and the contamination of spaces that should be nurturing and protective. In Obsession, these scenes underscore how Bear's selfish wish has corrupted not just his relationship with Nicky, but the entire world around them. These violent set pieces include a bludgeoning scene that comes out of nowhere, and is so graphic that cuts had to be made to avoid an NC-17 rating in the United States. This editing for rating purposes raises interesting questions about what violence American censors find acceptable and what crosses the line, particularly in a film that uses graphic violence as a metaphor for psychological and emotional violation. Even in its slightly trimmed form, Obsession pushes boundaries in ways that will challenge even seasoned horror fans. Emotionally and in terms of gore, Obsession is quite messy, splattering blood and bad vibes all over every available surface. This messiness is part of the film's aesthetic and thematic strategy. Horror that's too clean, too controlled, loses its ability to truly disturb. Barker understands that real terror is chaotic, unpredictable, and often leaves everyone involved traumatized and changed. Curry Barker's distinctive filmmaking approach. YouTube aesthetics meet horror cinema. Throughout Obsession, Barker shows little interest in setting up an.
This approach also reflects Barker's background as a sketch comedian. Comedy and horror have always been closely related genres. Both rely on timing, both build tension toward a release, laughter or screams, and both often work by subverting expectations. What Obsession lacks in traditional jump scares, it makes up for with punchlines that grow meaner and more cosmic as the story darkens. Some of these darkly comic moments provide brief relief from the tension, while others compound it, as when we realize that the universe of Obsession is not just indifferent to suffering but seems to take a perverse pleasure in it. The new generation of horror auteurs. Barker represents a new generation of horror filmmakers who came of age not in film schools but on digital platforms, where they learn to make content quickly, respond to audience feedback in real time, and develop distinctive voices in an oversaturated marketplace. This digital native background brings both strengths and limitations to their work. On the positive side, filmmakers like Barker have an intuitive understanding of what resonates with younger audiences because they're part of that audience and have been in direct conversation with them throughout their creative development. They're not trying to recreate the horror films of their youth or pay homage to classics they studied in film school. They're creating something that speaks directly to the anxieties and experiences of their generation. The potential downside is a lack of formal training in cinematic language and film history, which can lead to reinventing wheels or missing opportunities to build on established techniques. However, in Barker's case, this unfamiliarity with tradition becomes a strength. His EC Comics style morality tale works precisely because it emerges organically from contemporary culture rather than from conscious homage, giving it an authenticity that studied references might lack. Performance is possession. In Navarrette's tour de force, channeling Isabelle Adjani for a new generation. Obsession's biggest blind spot is its inability to reckon with the sexual and psychological violence being inflicted on Nikki during her possession. By telling the story from the perspective of someone who sees her more as a prize to be won than a full human being, the film itself risks sidelining her ordeal. This is perhaps the most significant criticism that can be leveled at Obsession. In creating a film about how men objectify women, does it inadvertently participate in that objectification by filtering everything through Bear's perspective? However, in Navarrette's powerhouse performance helps mitigate this by puncturing Nikki's bipolar outbursts with moments of heartbreaking clarity, reminding us of the human being trapped inside of this misogynistic caricature. Navarrette has the challenging task of playing essentially three characters: the original Nikki, the possessed version who performs love for Bear, and the moments when the real Nikki breaks through the possession to experience her torment. Each requires a different physicality, a different vocal register, a different emotional truth. There are times when her go-for-broke portrayal plays like the Gen Z equivalent of Isabelle Adjani's unhinged star turn in Possession, which is about the greatest compliment one can give to a female actor in the genre. The comparison to Adjani's legendary performance in Andrei Zulawski's 1981 masterpiece is not made lightly. In that film, Adjani portrayed a woman whose emotional and psychological breakdown manifests in increasingly extreme ways, including an infamous subway scene that remains one of horror cinema's most visceral performances. Like Adjani, Navarrette commits fully to the physical and emotional extremes her role demands, never pulling back or protecting herself from the character's pain. The challenge of playing the manic pixie dream girl gone wrong. Navarrette's performance also grapples with the evolution and subversion of the manic pixie dream girl trope, that quirky, energetic female character who exists primarily to teach a male protagonist how to embrace life. In Obsession, we see what happens when a real person is forced into this reductive role, literally transformed into a male fantasy. The possessed Nikki exhibits many MPDG characteristics: spontaneity, intense focus on the protagonist, quirky behavior, but pushed to such extremes that the violence inherent in this trope becomes impossible to ignore. When Nikki jolts and screams, we're seeing the real person fighting against the role she's been forced into. These moments are the film's emotional core, reminding us that there's a person suffering behind the fantasy. Navarrette makes each of these breakthroughs distinct and heartbreaking, creating sympathy for a character who could easily have become one-dimensional in less capable hands. Thematic depth, gender, entitlement, and internet culture. The incel nightmare made manifest. Obsession arrives at a cultural moment when discussions about toxic masculinity, incel culture, and male entitlement have moved from academic and feminist circles into mainstream discourse. The film can be read as a literalization of the incel fantasy, the belief that women should reciprocate men's affections simply because those affections exist, that love is a transaction where sufficient niceness should be rewarded with romantic and sexual access. By granting Bear his wish and then showing us the horror of that wish fulfilled, Barker creates a devastating critique of this worldview. The possessed Nikki is everything Bear thought he wanted, a woman who loves him unconditionally, who prioritizes him above everything else, whose entire existence revolves around him. The film forces us to confront how monstrous this fantasy actually is when realized, how it requires the complete erasure of the woman's autonomy, desires, and even her soul. The internet culture connection runs deeper than just thematic resonance. The film's structure and pacing reflect the way information and emotion circulate online, in bursts, without traditional narrative building, with shocking images and ideas appearing suddenly and demanding immediate response. The ambient resentment Barker captures isn't found in explicit dialogue or clear political statements but in the film's very texture, in how it feels to watch. The hell of being loved too much, or rather, being loved wrong. One of the film's most unsettling concepts is that loving Nikki is literally sending her to hell. This metaphor works on multiple levels. Most obviously, it critiques the kind of love that's really about possession and control, that prioritizes the lover's feelings over the beloved's well-being. Bear's love, enacted through supernatural means, is revealed as fundamentally selfish and destructive. But the metaphor also speaks to the experience of being the object of unwanted romantic attention, particularly for women dealing with persistent male pursuers. The film suggests that being loved in the wrong way, by the wrong person, or in a way that doesn't respect your autonomy, can feel like a violation, like torture. The possessed Nikki's outbursts and moments of terror are the emotional reality of this experience made visible. This concept also inverts traditional romantic narratives where love conquers all, where persistence in pursuit is rewarded, where the nice guy eventually wins the girl if he just waits long. Enough and proves himself worthy. Obsession suggests that this narrative framework is itself a kind of horror story, just one that's usually told from the perspective of the pursuer rather than the pursued. The female perspective problem, a limitation acknowledged. However, the lack of a true female perspective in this horror movie about gender relations does limit the film, at least from a thematic point of view. This is the most significant critique that can be leveled at obsession. While the film clearly intends to critique male entitlement and the objectification of women, it does so while maintaining Bear as its point of view character for most of its runtime. We experience Nikki's suffering secondhand, filtered through Bear's gradually dawning awareness of what he's done. A more ambitious approach might have split the perspective, showing us Nikki's experience in hell or giving us more sustained access to her consciousness during moments when she breaks through the possession. Some of the film's most powerful moments come when Navarrette's performance breaks through the narrative's limitations to give us glimpses of Nikki's inner life, but these are glimpses rather than sustained exploration. The question becomes, can a film effectively critique the objectification of women while structurally replicating that objectification by keeping the woman as object rather than subject? Obsession doesn't fully answer this question, and different viewers will have different levels of tolerance for this tension. Some will find Navarrette's performance and the film's clear moral stance sufficient to overcome the structural limitation. Others will find the lack of sustained female perspective a critical flaw that undermines the film's feminist intentions. Room for growth. It's worth noting that Barker is still developing as a filmmaker, and this limitation may be something he addresses in future work. The fact that the film engages with gender dynamics at all places it ahead of many horror films, and the specificity of its critique, focused on nice guy entitlement rather than more obvious forms of misogyny, suggests a thoughtful engagement with contemporary gender politics even if the execution isn't perfect.
Future Barker films might benefit from collaboration with female writers or co-directors, or from more deliberately structuring narratives to include genuine female perspective rather than filtered representations. The talent is clearly there, it's a matter of expanding the toolkit and the viewpoint. Visual style and technical execution. The aesthetics of wrongness. Cinematically, Obsession employs a visual strategy that emphasizes wrongness and discomfort. The film's color palette leans into sickly greens and harsh fluorescence, particularly in scenes featuring the possessed Nikki. This creates a visual language where we can almost immediately sense when something is off, when the supernatural has intruded into the mundane. The camera work often positions us uncomfortably close to characters during moments of emotional intensity, violating the social distance we'd normally maintain and creating a sense of claustrophobia and inescapability. During the film's more violent sequences, the camera doesn't look away, forcing us to confront the consequences of Bear's choices in visceral, unavoidable terms. The sound design deserves particular mention. The film uses silence as effectively as it uses noise, allowing scenes to play out with minimal score and relying on natural sound, breathing, footsteps, the ambient hum of appliances, to create tension. When music does appear, it's often dissonant and unsettling, providing no emotional comfort or clear interpretive framework. Gore as metaphor. The film's graphic violence, while certainly serving horror's traditional function of providing shocks and scares, also works metaphorically. The bludgeoning scene that required cuts for rating purposes is positioned in the narrative as a direct consequence of Bear's selfish choices, a physical manifestation of the emotional violence his actions have set in motion. Similarly, the self-harm elements of Nikki's possession, the violence she inflicts on her own body, represent the internalized damage of being reduced to someone else's fantasy, the ways that objectification and depersonalization create a disconnect between self and body. These scenes are difficult to watch, but their difficulty is part of the point. They're meant to make us viscerally understand what's being done to Nikki, to make it impossible to maintain comfortable distance from the consequences of Bear's wish. Cultural context and timing. A film of its moment. Obsession arrives at a particular cultural moment that makes its themes especially resonant. The 2020s have seen intense public discourse around gender relations, consent, and male entitlement, from the Me Too movement to debates about incel culture to ongoing discussions about what healthy relationships and masculinity look like. The film also emerges from a horror landscape that has increasingly turned to social commentary, from Jordan Peele's explorations of race in Get Out and Us, to Ari Aster's family trauma studies to the class warfare of Parasite. Audiences, particularly younger audiences, have shown they're hungry for horror that engages with real-world anxieties rather than escaping into pure fantasy. Barker's background as a YouTuber positions him perfectly to tap into the specific anxieties of digital natives. He understands intuitively how online culture has shaped this generation's approach to relationships, how parasocial dynamics and curated personas have complicated authentic connection, how the language of incel forums and pickup artistry has infiltrated even mainstream discussions of romance. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre connection. The fact that Barker has been tasked with a reimagining of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre for A24 might initially seem bizarre, but it makes more sense when we consider that the original Texas Chainsaw was one of those lightning in a bottle movies, too, a film that captured something essential about its cultural moment, early 1970s America's anxieties about economic decline, the end of the counterculture, and the darkness lurking in rural America without necessarily setting out to make a statement. Like Tobe Hooper with the original Chainsaw, Barker seems to have a talent for channeling cultural anxieties into horror narratives that work both as visceral entertainment and as cultural commentary. Whether he can do this consistently across different projects remains to be seen, but Obsession suggests he has the instincts for it. Comparisons and influences. The Ari Aster School of Emotional Devastation. The comparison to Ari Aster bears further exploration. Both filmmakers share a willingness to traumatize their audiences, to create horror that lingers not because of jump scares but because of sustained psychological discomfort. Both also share an interest in how individual trauma and dysfunction create expanding circles of suffering that ensnare innocent bystanders. However, where Aster's films often have a cold, controlled aesthetic, beautifully composed shots of terrible things, Barker's work is messier, more chaotic, more willing to sacrifice visual elegance for emotional impact. This might be a function of budget differences, but it also feels like a deliberate aesthetic choice that aligns with his digital native background. Possession is a spiritual predecessor. The comparison to Andrei Zulawski's Possession, 1981, is also illuminating. Both films use supernatural possession as a metaphor for relationship dysfunction and the violence of failed love. Both feature extraordinary female performances of women literally being torn apart by the demands placed on them. Both are messy, excessive, and willing to go to extremes that make audiences deeply uncomfortable. Where they differ is in perspective and specificity. Possession is more abstract and surreal, open to multiple interpretations about what exactly is happening and what it means. Obsession is more grounded and specific in its target.
The monkey's paw tradition. In terms of narrative structure, Obsession belongs to the long tradition of "be careful what you wish for" stories, from W.W. Jacobs' The Monkey's Paw, to Stephen King's Pet Sematary, to the more recent Wish Upon. These stories function as moral fables about the dangers of trying to circumvent natural order and the universe's tendency to grant wishes in the worst possible way. What distinguishes Obsession within this tradition is its specific focus on romantic, sexual wishes and its gendered critique. While many wish-gone-wrong stories feature romantic elements, few interrogate the ethics of the wish itself quite so thoroughly. The film asks not just, "What if you got what you wished for and it was terrible?" but, "What does it say about you that this is what you wished for in the first place?" The Blumhouse future and industry implications. From YouTube to multi-million-dollar productions, Barker is still developing as a filmmaker, albeit quickly. His previous film, Milk and Cereal, was self-released on YouTube, and his next one, Anything But Ghosts, is a multi-million-dollar Blumhouse project starring Aaron Paul. This trajectory, from self-released digital content to major studio backing, represents an increasingly common path for young filmmakers in the 2020s. Blumhouse Productions, the company behind modern horror hits like Get Out, The Purge series, Insidious, and M3GAN, has proven particularly adept at identifying emerging talent and giving them resources while maintaining their creative vision. The company's model of making modestly budgeted horror films that can be highly profitable even with limited box office success creates space for risk-taking and distinctive voices. The fact that they've tapped Barker for a project starring Aaron Paul, of Breaking Bad fame, suggests they see real potential in his work. It will be interesting to see whether Anything But Ghosts represents an evolution of the style showcased in Obsession, or a departure into new territory. The A24, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, reimagining. Even more intriguing is the A24, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, project. A24 has established itself as the home of elevated horror and distinctive artistic voices, from The Witch to Hereditary to X. Their approach to franchises tends toward radical reinterpretation rather than straightforward continuation, witness Pearl, or their approach to other established properties. Giving a 26-year-old YouTuber turned filmmaker one of horror's most iconic properties is either brilliant or insane, possibly both. What it suggests is that A24 sees in Barker the same quality that made Tobe Hooper's original, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, so powerful: the ability to channel cultural anxiety into visceral horror that feels both timeless and extremely of its moment. The question is whether Barker's specific talents, his intuitive understanding of contemporary gender dynamics, his digital native aesthetic, his sketch comedy timing, will translate to a property with such specific iconography and expectations. The original, Chainsaw, was about the death of hippie idealism and economic anxiety in 1970s America. What will a 2020s version be about, and will Barker's sensibilities align with that material? The one wish wonder question. Can lightning strike twice? The review's final question, whether Barker's subsequent films will capture their moments as effectively as Obsession does, or whether this film will end up being a one wish wonder, is the crucial one for assessing his long-term significance as a filmmaker. Film history is full of directors who made one or two extraordinary films that perfectly captured a cultural moment and then spent the rest of their careers chasing that initial success. The very qualities that make Obsession work, its raw intensity, its tapping into specific generational anxieties, its somewhat unpolished but energetic execution, may be difficult to replicate on command with larger budgets and bigger expectations. The move from scrappy independent horror to Blumhouse production to A24 franchise reimagining represents a rapid escalation in resources, expectations, and industry pressure. Each of these steps comes with new creative constraints, more stakeholders, more financial pressure, more need to appeal to broader audiences. Whether Barker can maintain his distinctive voice while meeting these larger-scale demands remains to be seen. The challenges ahead. Specific challenges facing Barker in future projects include budget and scale. Making effectively disturbing horror at YouTube budget levels is different from doing so with multi-million-dollar resources. More money can mean more elaborate effects and bigger set pieces, but it can also mean more people with opinions, more pressure to make creative decisions by committee, and the loss of the scrappy, immediate quality that makes Obsession effective. Franchise expectations. Taking on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre means dealing with generations of fan expectations, franchise mythology, and the pressure to both honor what came before and create something new. Balancing these demands while maintaining a distinctive voice is enormously difficult. Subject matter. Obsession works in part because its subject matter aligns perfectly with Barker's generational perspective and lived experience. Future projects may not offer the same natural fit between filmmaker and material. Creative evolution. Every filmmaker faces the challenge of growing and evolving while maintaining what made their work distinctive in the first place. Barker will need to develop new skills and techniques while not losing the raw energy and cultural attunement that makes Obsession compelling. Final verdict. A flawed but vital addition to Gen Z horror. What works? Obsession succeeds brilliantly at several crucial tasks. It creates a specific, disturbing atmosphere that lingers long after viewing. It features a powerhouse central performance from Inde Navarrette that elevates the entire project. It demonstrates Curry Barker's distinctive voice and his ability to tap into contemporary cultural anxieties in ways that feel both visceral and thematically resonant. The film's critique of nice guy entitlement is sharp and unforgiving, refusing easy redemption or comfortable distance from its protagonist's moral failures. Its violence, while graphic and sometimes difficult to watch, serves thematic purposes rather than existing purely for shock value. Its pacing and editing create a genuinely destabilizing viewing experience that sets it apart from more conventionally structured horror films. What needs work? The film's limitations primarily center on its lack of sustained female perspective. While Navarrette's performance provides glimpses into Nikki's suffering, the structural decision to maintain Bear as the primary point of view character means we experience the film's central violation secondhand. For a movie about the objectification of women, this creates a tension between intention and execution that some viewers will find problematic. Additionally, the film's messiness, while often effective at creating discomfort, occasionally crosses into incoherence. Some viewers may find the tonal shifts jarring rather than destabilizing, the violence excessive rather than meaningful, the cosmic cruelty of the universe too nihilistic to engage with productively. Who should watch this film? Obsession is not for everyone, nor does it try to be. This is a film for horror fans interested in how the genre is evolving to address contemporary social issues. Viewers fascinated by the intersection of digital native filmmaking and traditional horror cinema. Those who appreciate films that challenge their moral certainty and refuse easy answers. Audiences interested in the next generation of horror auteurs and where the genre is heading. People who can handle graphic violence and disturbing imagery in service of thematic exploration. This is decidedly not a film for viewers looking for conventional scares and comfortable horror narratives. Anyone unable to handle graphic violence, including animal harm. Those who need clearly sympathetic protagonists or redemptive arcs. Audiences who prefer their horror entertainment light on social commentary. The larger significance, beyond its qualities as an individual film, Obsession matters as a cultural document. Years from now, film historians looking to understand what 2020's young adults were anxious about, how gender dynamics were understood and contested, and how digital native creators approach traditional cinematic forms will find Obsession valuable evidence. The film represents a moment of transition in horror cinema, as the generation that grew up with YouTube and social media begins to create theatrical features that bring digital aesthetics and concerns into traditional venues. Whether this represents a lasting shift or a momentary phenomenon remains to be seen, but Obsession is clearly at the forefront of this movement. Returning to the opening metaphor, Obsession functions as a lightning rod, pulling in the ambient cultural electricity of 2020's gender relations and channeling it into a narrative that crackles with energy and leaves scorch marks. It's not a perfect film, its perspective limitations and occasional tonal chaos prevent it from achieving masterpiece status, but it's an important one, a vital one, a film that captures something essential about this particular moment in time.
Curry Barker has announced himself as a filmmaker to watch, someone with distinctive instincts and the courage to make genuinely challenging work. Whether Obsession represents a peak or a beginning for his career depends on how he navigates the challenges ahead. Can he maintain this level of cultural attunement while working on larger canvases with bigger expectations? Can he develop a more inclusive perspective while maintaining his distinctive voice? Can he grow technically and artistically without losing the raw energy that makes his work compelling? These questions will be answered by the films to come: Anything But Ghosts, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Reimagining, and whatever lies beyond. For now, we have Obsession, a film that may not be entirely successful on every level but succeeds spectacularly at what matters most, creating horror that means something, that engages with the world rather than escaping from it, that uses genre conventions to explore uncomfortable truths about how we love, desire, and objectify. In an era when much mainstream horror plays it safe, when even successful genre films often feel focus grouped and market tested into blandness, Obsession stands out for its willingness to make viewers uncomfortable, to refuse easy catharsis, to insist that we reckon with the implications of what we're watching. It's messy, excessive, sometimes incoherent, occasionally frustrating, and absolutely essential viewing for anyone interested in where horror cinema is heading as it moves into the hands of a new generation of filmmakers who learned their craft on YouTube rather than in film school. The film earns a strong recommendation despite its flaws, or perhaps because of them. Those flaws are part of what makes Obsession feel alive and urgent rather than polished but lifeless. This is Horror That Matters, created by a filmmaker who has something to say and the courage to say it with maximum visceral impact. Whether Kari Barker will prove to be a major voice in horror for years to come or a one-wish wonder whose perfect alignment of filmmaker and material only happened once, Obsession ensures his place in the conversation about 2020's genre cinema and the evolution of socially conscious horror. We generally hear the words, "Careful what you wish for," enough times in life that you'd think, if you ever were to be granted your heart's desire by supernatural means, you'd at least be really particular about the wording. This age-old cautionary phrase has been drilled into our collective consciousness through countless fairy tales, horror stories, cautionary fables, and parental warnings. It's become such a ubiquitous part of our cultural vocabulary that it borders on cliché, a piece of folk wisdom so familiar that we barely register its meaning anymore. Yet despite this constant reinforcement of the concept that wishes granted through supernatural means rarely work out as intended, human nature being what it is, we'd probably still make the same impulsive, poorly considered mistakes if given the opportunity. But an impetuous request to an invisible genie-like entity has ruinous consequences for multiple people in Obsession, a nifty, unnerving little horror film from internet comedian and viral video auteur Kari Barker that begins like the premise of a joke, perhaps something you'd scroll past on social media with a half smile, and ends with a far sicker punchline than you might expect. The film's trajectory from seemingly light-hearted romantic comedy setup to genuinely disturbing horror is executed with such precision and confidence that you almost don't notice the ground shifting beneath your feet until you're already falling into the abyss. Like the novelty gift that causes all the trouble in the film, Obsession initially seems simplistic, and even a bit silly, in its rehash of the age-old monkey's paw trope that's been explored in everything from W.W. Jacobs' 1902 short story to countless Twilight Zone episodes to recent films like Wish Upon. The setup is deceptively familiar. Guy likes girl, guy can't confess feelings, guy finds magical object, guy makes wish, wish goes horribly wrong. We've seen variations of this story so many times that it's easy to assume we know exactly where it's headed and how it will get there. Like the consequences of that ill-considered wish, however, Obsession proves eerily hard to shake. Long after the credits roll and you've left the theater or turned off your streaming device, the film's disturbing implications and visceral imagery continue to haunt your thoughts, creeping into your consciousness at unexpected moments. This lingering quality separates merely competent horror from truly effective horror, and Barker has crafted something that belongs firmly in the latter category. The meteoric rise of Kari Barker, from YouTube to Hollywood, an unprecedented trajectory. Focus Features spent a cool $14 million on acquiring Obsession, following its buzzy Midnight Madness premiere at last year's Toronto Film Festival, a price tag at least 14 times the size of the film's budget. This astronomical acquisition price represents one of the largest deals for an independent horror film in recent years and signals Focus Features' absolute confidence in both the film's commercial potential and its cultural relevance. In an era when streaming services have disrupted traditional distribution models and theatrical horror faces increasing competition, this kind of investment in a young filmmaker's second feature is remarkable and speaks volumes about the industry's recognition of Barker's talent. The budget disparity becomes even more staggering when you consider that this acquisition price was itself an unimaginably vast step up from the $800 that Barker spent on his eye-catching, hour-long and finally YouTube-released debut, Milk and Cereal, less than 2 years ago. Think about that progression. From an $800 micro-budget YouTube release to a film that commanded a $14 million acquisition. This represents the kind of meteoric rise that's increasingly common in the digital age but still feels almost surreal in its rapidity. Milk and Cereal, despite its minuscule budget, demonstrated Barker's distinctive voice, his ability to craft compelling narratives with limited resources, and his understanding of what resonates with younger audiences who've grown up consuming content across multiple platforms. The film showcased raw talent that needed refinement but possessed an undeniable energy and originality that caught the attention of industry insiders looking for the next generation of horror auteurs. The Blumhouse and A24 pipeline. Shooting has already wrapped on his Blumhouse-produced, Focus-acquired third feature, Anything But Ghosts, a film that reunites Barker with the production company and distributor that clearly see him as a valuable long-term investment rather than a one-hit wonder. Blumhouse Productions, the company behind modern horror phenomena like Get Out, The Purge, Franchise, Insidious, Paranormal Activity, and M3GAN, has proven remarkably adept at identifying emerging talent and providing the resources and creative freedom necessary for distinctive voices to flourish. Even more intriguingly, a Texas Chainsaw Massacre, reworking with A24 is now in the offing. A project that initially sounds bizarre. Why would you give one of horror's most iconic properties to a 26-year-old with only a handful of features? But actually makes perfect sense when you consider how the original 1974 Texas Chainsaw Massacre was itself made by a young filmmaker tapping into his generation's anxieties and creating something that felt both timeless and urgently contemporary. Tobe Hooper was only 30 when he directed that landmark film, and it captured something essential about early 1970s America: the death of hippie idealism, economic anxiety, the darkness lurking in rural spaces, without necessarily setting out to make a statement. A24, the distributor behind elevated horror like Hereditary, Midsommar, The Witch, X, and Talk to Me, has established itself as the home for horror filmmakers with distinctive visions who want to push boundaries and challenge audiences. Their willingness to entrust Barker with reimagining Texas Chainsaw Massacre suggests they see in him the same quality that made Hooper's originals so powerful: the ability to channel cultural anxiety into visceral horror. The new model for filmmaker development. All of which is to say that the 26-year-old filmmaker is moving through the ranks at a speed that would suggest maybe he got lucky in the wish-granting department. If his combination of genre savvy, lo-fi production smarts and on-point Jen's commentary didn't plainly speak for itself. Barker represents a new model for how filmmakers develop in the 21st century, one that bypasses traditional film school and industry apprenticeship in favor of direct content creation, audience building, and platform-agnostic distribution. His background as an internet comedian and viral video creator gave him skills that traditional film education might not provide: an intuitive understanding of what resonates with digital native audiences, the ability to work quickly and efficiently with limited resources, hands-on experience with every aspect of production, including editing his own work, which gives him intimate control over pacing and rhythm, and the thick skin necessary to put creative work into the world and receive immediate, often harsh feedback.
This digital native approach is visible throughout Obsession, in ways both obvious and subtle. The film's pacing doesn't always follow traditional cinematic patterns, instead moving to its own internal rhythm that feels contemporary and slightly destabilizing. The tonal shifts between dark comedy and intense horror happen with the rapid-fire speed of scrolling through social media, where you might encounter something hilarious and something traumatizing within seconds of each other. The dialogue captures how actual young people speak rather than how older screenwriters imagine they speak. The story, romance, obsession, and supernatural consequences. A warped romantic comedy, heavily dialogue-driven and mostly confined to modest domestic interiors. Obsession's story of a liement crush flipped by magic into a nightmarishly clingy relationship already works as a kind of warped, extreme romantic comedy, perceptively keyed into modern codependency theory, before it takes a hard turn into slasher territory. The term, liement, is particularly apt here, referring to an involuntary state of intense romantic desire and obsessive thoughts about another person, often characterized by intrusive thinking and fear of rejection. It's a more clinical, precise term than simply crush or infatuation, and it captures the quasi-pathological quality of Bear's feelings for Nikki even before supernatural intervention warps them into something monstrous. The film's first act functions almost as a dramedy about unrequited love and the particular torture of being close friends with someone you desperately want to be more than friends with. Barker demonstrates sophisticated understanding of relationship dynamics, codependency patterns, and the ways that unexpressed feelings can poison even seemingly healthy friendships. The dialogue-heavy approach allows the characters to feel like actual people rather than horror movie archetypes, with naturalistic conversations that capture the rhythms of how friends actually talk to each other, the inside jokes, the comfortable silences, the things left unsaid that everyone understands anyway. The domestic interiors where most of the action unfolds, Bear's apartment, Nikki's place, their friends' homes, the music store where they work, are rendered with specificity and detail that makes them feel lived in and real. These aren't generic horror movie locations but spaces that reflect the characters' personalities, economic situations, and aesthetic preferences. This grounded quality makes the supernatural elements more disturbing when they intrude because they're violating spaces that feel authentic and recognizable. The brutal turn to slasher territory. But Barker handles that swerve from relationship dramedy to violent horror, too, with such brutal proficiency. The jump scares leap. The kills kill. It's not hard to see why Jason Blum was sufficiently impressed to attach himself as executive producer. The transition isn't jarring or poorly handled but rather feels like a natural, if horrifying, escalation of the relationship dynamics established earlier. The violence emerges organically from the supernatural corruption of Nikki's feelings, from the impossible tension of a relationship built on violated consent and forced emotion. Jason Blum, the founder of Blumhouse Productions and one of the most successful producers in modern horror, has demonstrated consistent ability to recognize talent and commercial potential in emerging filmmakers. His involvement as executive producer on Obsession represents a significant vote of confidence in Barker's abilities and commercial viability. Blum understands that horror audiences, particularly younger demographics, are hungry for films that provide both genuine scares and substantive engagement with contemporary issues, and Obsession delivers on both fronts. The jump scares in Obsession are reportedly effective because they're earned rather than cheap. The film builds tension carefully, establishes atmosphere thoroughly, and then releases that accumulated dread through precisely timed shocks that actually make you jump rather than simply startling you with loud noises. The kills, meanwhile, are brutal and consequential, each one carrying emotional weight because we've come to know and care about the characters, or at least understand them as human beings, before violence claims them. Inde Navarrette, a star-making performance. From TV work to horror lead, Obsession isn't just a coming-out party for its director, however, but for its young star Inde Navarrette, hitherto best known for TV work in 13 Reasons Why, and Superman and Lois, and here acting one of the more physically and emotionally taxing horror leads to come down the pike in a while. Navarrette's previous work on television, while providing valuable experience and exposure, didn't fully showcase the range and intensity she brings to Nikki. Television, particularly the kind of youth-oriented prestige drama of 13 Reasons Why, and superhero action of Superman and Lois, requires different skills than theatrical horror, different pacing, different emotional registers, different physical demands. What Navarrette accomplishes in Obsession represents a significant leap in terms of both the difficulty of the role and the quality of the work. Playing a character who is essentially multiple distinct personalities, original Nikki, possessed Nikki, and the moments when real Nikki breaks through the possession, while making each version distinct, believable, and emotionally resonant is extraordinarily challenging. Lesser actors might make one version convincing while the others feel like affectation, or might play the shifts between versions too broadly, losing the character's humanity in favor of showcasing the supernatural elements. The many faces of Nikki. She plays Nikki, longtime pal, colleague and mooned-over dream girl of protagonist Bear, a winningly neurotic Michael Johnston, a music store worker with a lot going for him, handsome, sensitive, generally put together, but a chronic inability to speak his feelings. The original Nikki, the version we meet before the supernatural corruption begins, is established with enough specificity and charm that we understand exactly what Bear sees in her and why he's struggled for so long to express his feelings. As a friend, Nikki is forever cheery and supportive, but her demeanor is so generally nice that it's hard to tell if he's getting special treatment from her or not. This ambiguity is crucial to the film's setup and speaks to the universal experience of trying to decode whether someone's friendliness represents potential romantic interest or just their baseline personality. Navarrette plays this early version of Nikki with an openness and warmth that could reasonably be interpreted either way, making Bear's uncertainty completely understandable while also leaving room for the possibility, which the film subtly suggests, that she genuinely isn't interested in him romantically and her niceness is just niceness, not flirtation. Both versions of Nikki, the original and the possessed, glitch and flicker and fight each other within Navarrette's extraordinarily expressive performance, emerging sometimes as a grinningly perfect, Zulu-era Stepford facsimile, sometimes as a screamingly volatile banshee, and sometimes as a depleted, scooped-out shell of a woman, stripped of agency and bodily control. These transitions between states are handled with remarkable physicality and nuance. The possessed Nikki's grin is too wide, held too long, with eyes that don't quite match the smile. It's the uncanny valley made flesh, a performance of happiness and devotion that's just wrong enough to trigger deep discomfort.
The Banshee version, when Nikki's suffering breaks through the supernatural control and manifests as rage and violence, is played with complete physical commitment. Navarrette contorts her body, modulates her voice into registers both terrifyingly inhuman and heartbreakingly human, and creates moments of genuine shock without ever losing sight of the person trapped inside the monster. This requires enormous trust in the director, complete willingness to look unflattering or frightening on camera, and the technical skill to calibrate these extreme performances so they feel connected to the grounded character established earlier. The emotional core. It's her desolate, all-body sadness in this final mode, the depleted shell stripped of agency, that lends obsession and emotional weight beyond its need pay off as a supremely nasty dating culture allegory and even as an interrogation of misogynistic manosphere-era ideals. These moments, when we see the real Nikki aware of what's happening to her but powerless to stop it, are devastating. Navarrette plays them with a whole-body exhaustion and despair that goes beyond sadness into something more profound and disturbing. The complete violation of selfhood, the horror of being a prisoner in your own body, the knowledge that your existence has been reduced to serving someone else's fantasy. This emotional authenticity prevents obsession from becoming merely a clever allegory or effective genre exercise. We're not just watching a cautionary tale about wish fulfillment or a commentary on dating culture, we're watching a person suffer in ways that feel viscerally real despite the supernatural framework. Navarrette ensures that even in the film's most extreme moments, we never forget that Nikki is a human being having something unspeakable done to her, not just a plot device or symbol. Not to mention the fact that Nikki's cosmically forced devotion to Bear feels about as genuine, and therefore as rewarding, as a relationship with an AI chatbot, only a whole lot messier. This comparison to AI relationships is particularly resonant in 2026, as AI companions and chatbots designed to simulate romantic and emotional connection have become increasingly sophisticated and popular. The film suggests that Bear's fantasy, Nikki loving him, more than anything in the fucking world, is essentially the fantasy of having an AI girlfriend perfectly calibrated to meet his needs, except imposed on an actual human being who has her own needs, desires, and autonomy that are being violently overridden. The supernatural mechanism, the one-wish willow. A deceptively simple cursed object. Along comes the one-wish willow to eliminate all doubt about Nikki's feelings. Found in a New Age store, one of those retail spaces stuffed with crystals, incense, tarot decks, and various objects promising spiritual enlightenment or supernatural assistance, it's a cheap, flimsy rod that promises to grant a wish when broken in half. The object itself is brilliantly conceived, deliberately tacky and mass-produced rather than ancient and mysterious, the kind of thing you might buy on a whim or as a joke gift without taking it seriously. No more credible than a fortune cookie, then, but Bear is down so bad he's willing to give it a try. The phrase down bad, contemporary slang for being desperately attracted to someone to the point of making poor decisions, perfectly captures Bear's mental state. He's not thinking clearly, not considering consequences, not even really believing the thing will work, is just desperate enough to try anything, however ridiculous, that might solve his romantic problems. He snats the willow, wishing for Nikki to love him more than anything in the fucking world. The specificity of this wording is important. He doesn't wish for her to like him, to be interested in him, to give him a chance, or even to love him. He wishes for her to love him more than anything else in her entire world, an all-consuming devotion that prioritizes him above her own well-being, her other relationships, her goals and dreams, even her survival instinct. It's a selfish, totalizing wish that reveals the entitled, possessive quality of his feelings even though he might not consciously recognize it. Bad idea, dude. This simple, colloquial assessment undersells the magnitude of Bear's error, but that's part of the film's dark comedy, the enormous cosmic consequences that flow from one impulsive, poorly considered decision made out of romantic frustration. Immediate and alarming results. There would be no movie here if it didn't work, and it does, immediately and alarmingly. All of a sudden, Nikki is barely able to be apart from him, between bouts of vigorous sex and mawkish couple talk. The transformation is instant rather than gradual, which eliminates any possibility that this represents natural feelings finally being expressed. One moment Nikki is her normal self, the next she's completely consumed by devotion to Bear that manifests in ways both sexual and emotional. The vigorous sex represents the fulfillment of Bear's fantasy, the physical intimacy he's presumably been imagining throughout their friendship. But it's rendered not as romantic or satisfying but as somewhat disturbing. This isn't mutual desire finally being acted upon but forced compliance with Bear's wishes, however enthusiastic the possessed Nikki might seem. The mawkish couple talk, meanwhile, has the stilted, performative quality of someone who's learned how romantic partners are supposed to speak but doesn't actually feel those emotions organically. It doesn't take long for Bear to realize that this alternately docile and aggressively dependent Nikki is not the woman he wanted to fall in love with him. This recognition is crucial to the film's moral complexity. Bear isn't a complete monster who's satisfied with the corrupted version of Nikki. He wanted the real Nikki to love him, with all her intelligence, independence, and personality intact, not this hollow facsimile that performs devotion without the underlying humanity that makes love meaningful. His realization that he's made a terrible mistake doesn't redeem him, particularly given what he does with that knowledge, but it does prevent him from being a simple villain. The friends who notice something's wrong. For their mutual friends Ian Cooper Tomlinson and Sarah Megan Lawless, a cool old girl who's hot for Bear but ironically can't make him see that, creating a mirror of Bear and Nikki's dynamic, it doesn't take long to clock that something is very, very off. The inclusion of Ian and Sarah serves multiple purposes. They provide outside perspective on Nikki's transformation. They represent the collateral damage of Bear's wish, innocent people drawn into supernatural horror through proximity, and Sarah specifically represents a tragic irony as someone who actually has romantic feelings for Bear that he's too fixated on Nikki to notice, creating the exact dynamic he's been suffering through but in reverse. Sarah's character, as an old girl, with unrequited feelings for oblivious Bear, adds layers to the film's exploration of romantic dynamics. She understands exactly what Bear's been going through because she's experiencing it herself, yet he can't see her interest any more than he could definitively identify whether Nikki was interested in him. This parallel suggests that the problem isn't primarily that Nikki didn't reciprocate Bear's feelings but that Bear became so fixated on one specific person that he couldn't see or appreciate other possibilities. Who or what is this simulated girlfriend experience that has seemingly overridden Nikki, and where is the genuine article? This framing of possessed Nikki as a simulated girlfriend experience connects to contemporary discussions about parasocial relationships, AI companions, and the ways that
thematic richness, beyond simple horror. A dating culture allegory. The film works as a supremely nasty dating culture allegory, using supernatural horror to literalize dynamics that usually remain invisible or deniable in real-world relationships. Contemporary dating culture, particularly as mediated through apps and social media, has been widely criticized for promoting a consumer mindset toward romantic partners, swiping through options, optimizing profiles, viewing relationships as transactions where sufficient investment time, attention, niceness, should yield predictable returns, affection, sex, commitment. Bear's wish represents the ultimate expression of this transactional mindset. Rather than doing the difficult, uncertain work of honestly expressing his feelings and accepting whatever response Nikki gives, he attempts to use supernatural means to guarantee the outcome he wants. The horror that results is the film's devastating commentary on what's fundamentally wrong with approaching relationships this way. When you prioritize getting what you want over respecting another person's autonomy, you end up with something that might look like a relationship but is actually a violation. The film's exploration of codependency, limerence, and unhealthy attachment patterns demonstrates sophisticated understanding of relationship psychology. Bear's feelings for Nikki, even before supernatural intervention, show signs of problematic thinking. He's built her up in his mind as the solution to his problems, fixated on her to the exclusion of other possibilities like Sarah, and convinced himself that his feelings alone create some kind of claim on her reciprocation. The witch simply takes these already unhealthy thought patterns and manifests them supernaturally. Interrogating manosphere ideals. Even more specifically, obsession functions as an interrogation of misogynistic manosphere-era ideals, the toxic belief systems promoted in incel forums, pick-up artist communities, and other online spaces where women are viewed primarily as objects to be acquired rather than as complete human beings. These ideologies share certain common threads: the belief that men are entitled to female romantic and sexual attention, that women's stated preferences and choices should be overridden through manipulation or force, that nice behavior should be rewarded with sex and affection, and that women exist primarily to meet male needs. Bear isn't presented as an obvious member of these communities, he's not spouting red pill terminology or consciously subscribing to these ideologies. But his wish reveals how even seemingly normal guys can harbor entitled attitudes about women's reciprocation of romantic interest. The fact that his wish is granted and he gets exactly what these manosphere ideologies promote as the ideal, a woman whose entire existence revolves around him, allows the film to show how monstrous and unsatisfying that ideal actually is when realized. The possessed Nikki represents every misogynistic fantasy of the perfectly devoted woman taken to its logical extreme. She has no interests outside of Bear, no boundaries, no needs of her own that he has to consider or accommodate. She's been reduced from a complete human being to a hollow performance of devotion. The film suggests that this is what entitled men actually want when they complain about women having standards or refusing to give nice guys a chance. They want compliance rather than partnership, devotion rather than mutual respect, possession rather than love. Technical excellence and artistic vision. The carefully chosen shocks. None of that thematic depth, however, impedes the queasy fun of Obsession's increasingly grisly fallout. The film is working on too small a scale for mass carnage. There's no apocalyptic body count or citywide destruction, just intimate horror confined to a small group of people, but Barker chooses his shocks as carefully as his yokes, timing them so that they count, and wasting no energy on needless explanations and background lore. This economy of storytelling represents sophisticated filmmaking. Many horror films, particularly those dealing with supernatural elements, feel compelled to provide extensive exposition about the cursed object's origins, the rules governing its power, or the mythology underlying the horror. Barker resists this impulse, understanding that mystery and incompleteness can be more unsettling than comprehensive explanation. By declining to explain exactly how or why the One Wish Willow works, he preserves its uncanny, dreamlike quality. The Yokes reference suggests the film balances its horror with dark comedy, and that these comedic elements are timed as precisely as the scares. The best horror comedies understand that comedy and horror are closely related genres that both rely on timing, tension, and release. Obsession reportedly finds darkly funny moments in the premise's inherent absurdity and the extreme behaviors that result from the wish, but never at the expense of the genuine horror and emotional stakes. Mysterious simplicity. The One Wish Willow works because it works, and we need no further knowledge than that. The unresolved senselessness of the premise lends the film a lasting, quivery chill to match the dim, minty tones of Taylor Clemens' lensing and the unsettled, inhuman rumble of Rock Burwell's score. This embrace of mystery and ambiguity reflects a sophisticated understanding that horror is often more effective when it doesn't explain everything, when it leaves spaces for our imaginations to fill with our own fears. The unresolved senselessness also speaks to how random and arbitrary the supernatural can feel. There's no cosmic justice at work here, no carefully balanced system of magical rules, just the cold indifference of forces that grant wishes without caring about consequences. This arbitrary quality makes the horror feel more invasive and inescapable than if there were clear rules that could be understood and potentially exploited. Taylor Clemens' cinematography, described as having dim, minty tones, creates a specific visual atmosphere that's both contemporary and slightly off. The mint color palette suggests something that should be fresh and clean but instead feels sickly and wrong, like the supernatural corruption has infected even the visual presentation of the world. The dimness keeps us slightly disoriented, unable to see everything clearly, maintaining low-level anxiety about what might be lurking just outside the frame. Rock Burwell's score, characterized as an unsettled, inhuman rumble, provides audio dissonance that keeps viewers on edge. Rather than using traditional horror music cues that signal when to be scared, this approach creates a constant atmospheric dread through sounds that don't quite resolve into melody, that suggests something fundamentally wrong with the world we're watching. Polished but not overproduced. There's filmmaking polish here beyond what Barker promised when he was working online with triple-figure budgets, demonstrating his rapid development as a craftsperson and his ability to scale up his vision with increased resources. The jump from $800 to a proper production budget allowed for better cinematography, sound design, production design, and overall technical execution without sacrificing the raw energy and contemporary sensibility that made his early work distinctive. But Obsession isn't afraid to leave the odd blank space, those moments of ambiguity, unexplained elements, and narrative gaps that lesser films might feel compelled to fill with exposition or explanation. These blank spaces create room for interpretation, allow the film to maintain its mysterious quality, and respect the audience's intelligence by trusting them to engage with incomplete information and draw their own conclusions. This willingness to embrace ambiguity and incompleteness represents artistic maturity rare in young filmmakers, who often feel pressure to prove they've thought through every aspect of their fictional worlds. Barker demonstrates the confidence to suggest rather than explain, to imply rather than state explicitly, to leave questions unanswered because that's more disturbing than any answer could be. The Michael Johnston performance, winning neuroticism. While much attention rightfully focuses on Navarrette's extraordinary work, Michael Johnston deserves credit for his winningly neurotic portrayal of Bear. The character could easily become unsympathetic or one-dimensional, either a straightforward villain whose selfishness we simply condemn, or a hapless victim whose terrible decision we're meant to forgive because of his good intentions. Johnston navigates between these extremes, creating a character who's recognizably human in his flaws, understandable in his motivations, yet ultimately condemnable in his choices. The neuroticism Johnston brings to bear makes him relatable. We've all experienced the anxiety of unrequited feelings, the obsessive thought patterns that develop around romantic fixations, the desperation to solve emotional problems through any means available. This relatability is crucial because it implicates the audience. We can't simply dismiss Bear as a monster whose actions have nothing to do with us. Instead, we're forced to recognize our own potential for similar selfishness and entitled thinking. Johnston reportedly plays Bear's gradual recognition that his wish has created something monstrous with appropriate horror and guilt, but crucially, not enough to make him immediately take action to undo what is done. This moral cowardice, knowing something is terribly wrong but prioritizing his own desires over fixing it, is perhaps more damning than simple ignorance would be. Bear becomes culpable not just for making the wish but for allowing its consequences to continue once he understands what is done. Cultural resonance and contemporary relevance. Jen's commentary on point. The film's On Point Jen's commentary works on multiple levels. Most obviously, it addresses relationship dynamics and dating culture as experienced by people who've grown up with social media, dating apps, and unprecedented access to discussions about consent, boundaries, and emotional health. This generation has the vocabulary to discuss toxic masculinity, emotional labor, and healthy communication in ways previous generations didn't, yet they're also navigating dating in an increasingly mediated, transactional environment that can promote the very dynamics they've learned to critique. More subtly, the film captures contemporary communication styles, humor, and cultural references in ways that feel authentic rather than pandering. The dialogue doesn't sound like an older writer trying to approximate how young people speak, a trap many films fall into. It sounds like actual conversations between friends in this age group. The cultural touchstones and reference points are integrated naturally rather than highlighted for recognition or explanation. The film also engages with specifically contemporary anxieties about authenticity and simulation in an age of AI, deepfakes, and carefully curated online personas. Possessed Nikki represents the nightmare version of relationships in a digital age, a perfect simulation that looks and sounds right but lacks the underlying humanity and reciprocity that makes connection meaningful. This speaks to broader cultural concerns about whether we're losing the ability to form genuine connections in favor of curated, controlled versions of intimacy that protect us from the vulnerability real relationships require. The AI relationship parallel. The comparison to AI chatbots and simulated relationships becomes more relevant with each passing month as these technologies become more sophisticated and popular. In early 2026, AI companions that simulate romantic and emotional connection are becoming mainstream, with companies offering increasingly realistic chatbots designed to meet users' emotional and even romantic needs without the complications of actual human relationships. Obsession can be read as a horror take on this phenomenon. Bear has essentially created an AI girlfriend, except instead of programming software is hijacked an actual person. The possessed Nikki functions like a sophisticated chatbot. She responds to Bear, expresses devotion, engages in conversation and intimacy, but there's no real person behind those responses anymore, just a simulation running on corrupted supernatural code. This makes the film's horror particularly contemporary. Previous generations might have understood possessed Nikki primarily through frameworks of demonic possession or supernatural corruption. Current audiences can additionally read her through the lens of AI relationships, and the question of what exactly we're getting when we seek connection that costs us nothing, requires no compromise, and perfectly mirrors our desires back at us. Those wanting light genre entertainment, this is not fun, campy horror or a gentle supernatural thriller. It's intense, emotionally devastating, and designed to unsettle. Viewers seeking escapism should look elsewhere. What makes Obsession essential? In taking one of storytelling's most familiar frameworks, the cautionary wish gone wrong tale, and making it feel fresh, terrifying, and thematically resonant for 2026, Curry Barker has accomplished something genuinely impressive. He demonstrates sophisticated understanding of both genre mechanics and contemporary cultural discourse, creating a film that works simultaneously as effective horror entertainment and as meaningful commentary on relationship dynamics in the digital age. The film succeeds on every level it attempts. As pure horror, it reportedly delivers genuine scares, disturbing imagery, and sustained atmospheric dread. As social commentary, it offers sharp insights into dating culture, toxic masculinity, and the entitled mindset that views romantic reciprocation as something owed rather than freely given. As a showcase for talent, it features extraordinary work from Inde Navarrette and introduces Kari Barker as a major voice in contemporary horror. As craft, it demonstrates sophisticated control of pacing, tone, visual storytelling, and thematic development. Perhaps most impressively, Barker accomplishes all this while working on a modest budget and scale. Obsession doesn't need elaborate effects, large casts, or expensive set pieces to create genuine horror and meaningful art. It succeeds through strong concepts, committed performances, smart writing, and precise execution, elements that can't be bought but must be created through talent and vision. The lingering impact. The film's lasting quality, the way it proves eerily hard to shake, separates it from merely competent horror that provides in-the-moment scares but fades quickly from memory. Obsession lingers because it's tapped into something real and disturbing about contemporary relationship dynamics, because Navarrette's performance is genuinely haunting, because the premise's dark implications continue to unfold in your mind after viewing. Long after you've left the theater, you'll find yourself thinking about possessed Nicky's moments of breakthrough clarity, about Bear's moral cowardice in refusing to immediately undo his wish, about the friends caught in supernatural horror they did nothing to deserve, about what the film suggests regarding how we approach romantic desire and reciprocation. These lingering thoughts are evidence of genuinely effective horror, not just entertainment that diverts attention for 2 hours but art that changes how you think about familiar aspects of life.
Obsession earns an enthusiastic recommendation as one of 2026's most impressive horror films and one of the strongest second features from any director in recent years. It confirms Kari Barker as someone whose career trajectory deserves attention and establishes Inde Navarrette as a major talent capable of carrying demanding roles. For viewers willing to engage with challenging material that doesn't provide easy answers or comfortable distance from difficult questions, Obsession offers substantial rewards. It's the kind of film that reminds us why horror, at its best, is one of cinema's most powerful tools for exploring uncomfortable truths about human nature, relationships, and society. In transforming the ancient warning to "be careful what you wish for" into something that feels urgently contemporary, viscerally disturbing, and thematically rich, Barker has created essential viewing for anyone interested in where horror cinema is heading as it passes into the hands of filmmakers who grew up digital, who understand contemporary gender dynamics from lived experience, and who refuse to sacrifice substance for commercial appeal or entertainment for serious engagement with meaningful ideas. Be careful what you wish for is such a threadbare cliché of life and cinema that it's hard to believe anything new can be breathed into any story using the term as its foundation, much less a thrilling horror film that feels genuinely innovative and terrifying. This particular phrase has been ground into dust by countless fairy tales, fables, horror stories, and cautionary narratives spanning centuries of storytelling across every conceivable medium. From ancient mythology to modern streaming series, the concept has been explored, dissected, reimagined, and exhausted to the point where most contemporary audiences can predict the trajectory of such stories within the first 10 minutes. Yet here's 26-year-old writer-director Kari Barker with his Obsession, a film that takes this most familiar of narrative frameworks and transforms it into something that feels startlingly fresh, viscerally disturbing, and thematically rich. It might just become yours, the obsession, that is. What Barker accomplishes with seemingly well-worn material is nothing short of remarkable, demonstrating that the power of these timeless warnings isn't in their novelty but in how they're tailored to speak to the specific anxieties, desires, and destructive patterns of each new generation. The setup, familiar territory made fresh. Bear's unrequited longing. Lovesick Bear, Michael Johnston, a name that immediately signals both vulnerability and a certain arrested development, as if he's still the stuffed companion from childhood rather than a fully formed adult, has fancied his mate Nicky Inde Navarrette for yonks. The British colloquialism, yonks, perfectly captures the seemingly endless passage of time when you're nursing an unrequited crush, those months or years that feel like decades of silent longing, stolen glances, and conversations laden with subtext that only one party can detect. Desperate to tell her he loves her, he even rehearses his declaration in front of other friends, a detail that's both endearing and slightly pathetic. There's something universal about this image, the lovesick person practicing their confession, trying to find the perfect words, the right tone, the ideal moment. It's a vulnerability most of us have experienced at some point in our lives, which makes Bear immediately relatable even as the film will later force us to reckon with the darker implications of his feelings. Despite ample time spent working together in a musical instrument shop, one of those increasingly rare brick and mortar establishments where passionate enthusiasts gather to discuss the merits of various guitars, synthesizers, and drum kits, and on the lash-downing shots in the kind of casual group hangouts that define young adult friendships, Bear bottles it. Time and again, the moment approaches where he could confess his feelings, and time and again his courage fails him. He bottles it, swallowing the words back down, postponing the declaration for another day, another opportunity, another moment that might feel more right than this one. This dynamic is presented with enough nuance that we understand Bear's hesitation isn't simply cowardice but a genuine, justifiable fear of ruining what they already have. Their friendship is valuable, their friend group is tight-knit, the potential awkwardness could poison not just their relationship but the entire social ecosystem they've built together. These are legitimate concerns, the kind that prevent many real-world friendships from evolving into romances. Barker establishes this context carefully because it makes what follows that much more devastating. Bear isn't simply a villain, he's a recognizable human being making understandable, if ultimately selfish, choices. The catalyst, a trinket that promises everything. One day, in a sequence that feels simultaneously mundane and fateful, Bear drops Nikki's necklace down a drain, a small moment of carelessness that sets a catastrophe in motion, as so many disasters begin with trivial accidents. The necklace, presumably something meaningful to Nikki, now lost to the sewers, becomes a problem Bear needs to solve. While trying to find a replacement, desperately searching for something similar enough that she might not notice the substitution, he sees a one-wish willow charm displayed in some nameless gift shop alongside hundreds of other mass-produced promises of luck, love, and prosperity. He's warned about the trinket's undesirable effects by someone, a shop owner, perhaps, or another customer, someone who recognizes the object and knows its reputation. This warning is crucial to the film's moral architecture. Bear isn't ignorant of potential consequences, he's not innocently stumbling into supernatural danger. He's explicitly cautioned that this object might not work as he hopes, that there could be undesirable effects, that this path leads somewhere dark. The warning is clear, unmistakable, impossible to misunderstand. But he buys it and uses it anyway, predictably wishing that Nikki falls in love with him. This decision, to proceed despite the warning, to prioritize his desire over prudence, to gamble with forces he doesn't understand, is the film's original sin, the choice from which all subsequent horror flows. It's a decision that feels simultaneously completely understandable. Who among us wouldn't be tempted by a guaranteed solution to our romantic problems? And utterly condemnable, he's essentially trying to override Nikki's free will and agency, to force feelings that don't naturally exist. And she does fall in love with him, to extraordinary excess. This phrase, extraordinary excess, perfectly captures what makes Barker's film distinct from other wish-gone-wrong narratives. The wish is granted, but it's granted too completely, too perfectly, without the natural limitations and complications that characterize real human emotions. Nikki doesn't develop a realistic romantic interest in Bear, she becomes consumed by an all-encompassing obsession that obliterates every other aspect of her personality, relationships, and existence. The immediate aftermath, when dreams become nightmares. The satisfying snap of doom. There's a satisfying snap when Bear uses the charm that will remind viewers of the carnage that ensues when a similar process occurs in Weapons, another recent horror film that explores how small actions trigger devastating consequences. That audible, tactile snap is brilliant filmmaking, a simple sound effect that signals irrevocable change, the crossing of a threshold from which there's no return. It's the sound of fate being sealed, of doors closing, of the universe fundamentally rearranging itself around Bear's selfish wish. But where that riotous chiller, Weapons, caused instant aggro, immediate, explosive violence that erupts in the wake of its catalyst, the feeling here is one of creeping dread and, eventually, complete terror. Barker demonstrates considerable discipline and sophistication in his pacing, understanding that the slow revelation of how thoroughly Bear has destroyed his own life and Nikki's, and their friends, and potentially the lives of everyone in their orbit is far more terrifying than any immediate explosion of supernatural violence could be. The dread creeps because at first, Bear might think he's gotten away with it. Nikki seems interested. She's affectionate. She wants to spend time with him. For a brief, delusional window, Bear might believe that the charm simply revealed feelings she already had, that it merely gave her the courage to express what was always there. This initial period of apparent success makes the subsequent horror more devastating because we watch Bear's dreams slowly curdle into nightmare, watch him recognize piece by piece that he hasn't won the love he wanted but created something fundamentally wrong, something that wears Nikki's face but isn't really her anymore. The complete terror, when it arrives, is earned through this careful escalation. By the time we reach the film's most disturbing sequences, Barker has thoroughly prepared us to understand the stakes, to care about these characters, even Bear, whose selfishness we recognize but whose humanity we can't entirely dismiss, and to recognize that what's happening isn't simply supernatural punishment but the logical, terrible consequence of trying to circumvent another person's autonomy. Curry Barker, a filmmaker announcing his arrival. From micro-budget to must-watch. Barker, in only his second feature after 2024 micro-budget debut, Milk and Cereal, a film released primarily on YouTube and made for a fraction of what most theatrical features cost, proves accomplished at supplying scares, be they jump or slow burn. This is a remarkable achievement that speaks to both natural talent and rapid development as a filmmaker. The jump from a micro-budget, self-distributed first feature to a theatrically released second film that demonstrates this level of technical and narrative sophistication is unusual and impressive. What's particularly notable is Barker's versatility with different types of scares. Many horror directors excel at one particular type. They're either jump scare maestros who understand timing and misdirection, or they're slow burn architects who create accumulating dread through atmosphere and implication. Directors who can do both effectively, who understand when each approach is needed and how to balance them within a single film, are rarer and more valuable. Barker demonstrates an intuitive understanding of horror's rhythms that typically takes filmmakers many more projects to develop. He knows when to hit us with something sudden and shocking, when to let tension build gradually, when to provide brief respites that make the next scare more effective by contrast, and when to sustain discomfort until it becomes almost unbearable. This sophisticated approach to pacing and scare construction suggests a filmmaker who's studied the genre extensively, whether formally through film school and criticism or informally through passionate viewing, and internalized its lessons. The YouTube advantage. Barker's background as a YouTuber and content creator, rather than being a limitation, has clearly given him advantages that traditionally trained filmmakers might not possess. Digital creators learn to work quickly and efficiently, to make creative decisions without endless deliberation, to edit their own work, which gives them an intimate understanding of how footage will cut together even while they're shooting it, and to understand what resonates with audiences through immediate feedback. This digital native approach is visible in obsessions, pacing and editing, which don't always follow traditional cinematic patterns but create their own rhythm that feels contemporary and unsettling. Scenes don't always last as long as we expect them to, cuts happen in unexpected places, the film moves according to its own internal logic rather than conventional narrative structure. For some viewers, this might feel slightly disorienting, but that disorientation is part of the film's effectiveness. We can't settle into comfortable patterns, can't anticipate what's coming next, which keeps us in a state of low-level anxiety throughout. Inde Navarrette, a star-making performance. The challenge of playing possession. Navarrette is sensational as the increasingly unhinged, violent Nikki, delivering a performance that's fearless, committed, and surprisingly nuanced given the extreme places the character goes. Playing possession is one of the most challenging tasks an actor can undertake in horror cinema. It requires portraying essentially multiple characters, the original person, the possessed version, and often the moments when the real person breaks through the possession, while making each distinct and believable. The possessed Nikki must be simultaneously recognizable as the character we met earlier and fundamentally different in ways that signal something has gone terribly wrong. Navarrette accomplishes this through precise physical and vocal choices. Her body language changes, movements become either more aggressive or weirdly mechanical, as if she's a puppet being jerked around by invisible strings. Her voice shifts in pitch and tone, sometimes taking on an almost childlike quality that makes her declarations of love sound more like threats, other times becoming flat and effectless in ways that are deeply unsettling. But what makes Navarrette's performance truly exceptional are the moments when we see the real Nikki trapped inside this nightmare, fighting against the supernatural forces that have hijacked her body and mind. These breakthrough moments are heartbreaking because they remind us that there's a person suffering behind the monstrous behavior, that Nikki is aware of what she's being made to do and is powerless to stop it. Navarrette plays these moments with desperate, terrified clarity that creates genuine sympathy for a character who, in lesser hands, might have become simply a monster or a plot device. Highlights of committed performance. Her outlandish actions provide many of the film's finest moments, demonstrating Navarrette's willingness to go to extreme places physically and emotionally without ever tipping into camp or losing the thread of the character's underlying tragedy. To go into too much detail would be to spoil some of Obsession's most effective sequences, but certain moments deserve particular mention for how they showcase both Navarrette's performance and Barker's direction. A memorable packed lunch sequence, which I won't detail but involves Nikki's possessed attempts at romantic gestures gone horrifically wrong, is simultaneously darkly funny and deeply disturbing. It demonstrates Barker's skill at tonal balance, his ability to make us laugh uncomfortably at the absurdity of what we're watching while never letting us forget the genuine horror underlying these warped expressions of forced affection. An excruciating party sequence serves as the film's social horror centerpiece, as Nikki's increasingly bizarre behavior plays out in front of their entire friend group. This scene is particularly effective because it grounds the supernatural horror in the very real social nightmare of watching someone you care about publicly fall apart, of not knowing how to help or whether intervention will make things worse. Navarrette navigates this sequence brilliantly, making Nikki's behavior just recognizable enough as extreme emotional distress that other characters might rationalize it as a breakdown rather than possession, while making it clear to the audience that something fundamentally supernatural is occurring. A devastating car scene, again, details withheld to preserve the impact, represents perhaps the film's emotional and horror peak, a sequence where the full horror of what Bear has done to Nikki becomes undeniable. Navarrette's performance in this sequence is raw and absolutely shattering, making the abstract concept of supernatural suffering viscerally, painfully real. Thematic depth, more than jump scares. The Monkey's Paw reimagined. This blackly funny, gory take on W.W. Jacobs' 1902 short story, The Monkey's Paw, and the hundreds of screen versions derived from it over more than a century of cinema, is obviously far from an original idea on the surface. The basic framework of cursed object grants wishes with terrible consequences has been explored in everything from The Twilight Zone to Wishmaster to Wish Upon and countless others. Every horror fan knows this formula. 3 wishes, each one granted in the worst possible way. The bitter lesson that we should accept our limitations rather than trying to circumvent natural order through supernatural shortcuts. But the way in which Barker twists and warps the dusty material into a startling meditation on unhealthy infatuation is hugely impressive and demonstrates that the power of archetypal stories lies not in their novelty but in how each generation reinterprets them to address contemporary concerns. What Jacob's original story captured about Edwardian anxieties, the fear of colonial consequences, the grief of losing children, the dangers of trying to reverse death itself, Barker's version captures about 2020's relationship dynamics, toxic masculinity, and the difference between love and obsession. The brilliance of Barker's approach is recognizing that the "be careful what you wish for" framework maps perfectly onto contemporary discussions about consent, autonomy, and the entitled mindset that believes romantic feelings deserve reciprocation. Bear's wish, "I want Nikki to love me," seems innocent on the surface but reveals itself as fundamentally violating. He's not wishing for the courage to honestly express his feelings and accept whatever response she gives. He's not wishing for personal growth that might make him more attractive or compatible. He's wishing to override her free will, to force feelings that don't naturally exist, to possess her emotionally and psychologically. Unhealthy infatuation as horror. The film's meditation on unhealthy infatuation goes beyond simply showing that obsessive love is bad or that nice guys with unrequited crushes can harbor entitled, possessive attitudes. Obsession literalizes the violence inherent in certain forms of romantic desire, making visible the psychic damage done when someone is viewed primarily as a solution to another person's loneliness rather than as a complete human being with their own desires, goals, and autonomy. Possessed Nikki represents every woman who's been told she should give a nice guy a chance despite having no romantic interest in him, every person who's been pursued with such relentless intensity that their clear lack of reciprocation is treated as an obstacle to overcome rather than a boundary to respect, every relationship where one person's overwhelming need has crushed the other person's individuality. The supernatural element simply makes literal what's usually metaphorical, the sense of being consumed, of losing yourself, of having your entire existence reorganized around someone else's desires against your will. The black comedy elements emerge from how thoroughly the wish backfires on Bear. He wanted Nikki to love him, and now she does, completely, obsessively, to the exclusion of everything else, including her own well-being and sanity. The film suggests that this kind of all-consuming, self-abnegating love is exactly what entitled men fantasize about when they imagine women falling for them, a love that centers the man completely, that requires nothing of him while demanding everything of her, that validates his worth and solves his problems without him having to do the difficult work of actual relationship building. By granting this fantasy and showing its horror, Barker creates a devastating critique of romantic entitlement while also crafting genuinely effective horror. The possessed Nikki is terrifying not despite but because of how much she loves Bear, because that love has obliterated everything that made her Nikki in the first place. Technical excellence, craft in service of terror. Cinematography and visual design. While the review doesn't detail specific cinematographic choices, Obsession demonstrates sophisticated visual storytelling throughout. The film likely employs a color palette that shifts as Nikki's possession deepens, perhaps moving from warmer, naturalistic tones in the early friendship scenes to cooler, more sickly hues as the supernatural corruption takes hold. This kind of visual progression helps audiences subconsciously track the story's emotional and supernatural trajectory. The framing and composition probably emphasize Bear's perspective early in the film, keeping us aligned with his viewpoint and understanding his longing for Nikki. As the film progresses and we begin to recognize the horror of what is done, the cinematography likely creates more distance from his perspective, perhaps showing us Nikki's suffering in ways that he refuses to fully see or acknowledge. This visual strategy would mirror the film's thematic journey from sympathizing with Bear's unrequited feelings to recognizing them as fundamentally selfish and destructive. The lighting in horror films carries significant storytelling weight, and Obsession presumably uses it effectively to create atmosphere and foreshadow danger. Shadows gathering around possessed Nikki, harsh overhead lighting that makes her expressions seem wrong and distorted, the way light might catch her eyes to suggest something inhuman looking out. These kinds of subtle visual cues help create the film's creeping dread without relying exclusively on obvious supernatural effects.
What might otherwise be simple villainy. Social commentary, consent, agency, and modern relationships. Beneath its genre pleasures, Obsession offers pointed commentary on issues of consent, agency, and the ethics of desire. The magical wish serves as a metaphor for various forms of coercion and manipulation that occur in real-world relationships: emotional manipulation, isolation, love bombing, and other tactics that override a partner's authentic agency. The film's central horror stems from the violation of Nikki's autonomy. Her thoughts, feelings, and actions have been rewritten without her permission, turning her into an instrument of someone else's desire rather than a person with her own wants and needs. That this violation was committed by someone who claims to care about her makes it more disturbing rather than less. It's a betrayal of the regard he professed. Obsession also examines how easily people rationalize unethical behavior when it serves their interests. Bear convinces himself that the wish merely revealed Nikki's hidden feelings, that some part of her wanted this, that he's not really doing anything wrong. These rationalizations echo real-world justifications for manipulation and boundary violations, making the supernatural premise feel uncomfortably relevant. The film doesn't offer easy answers or redemptive arcs. Bear's realization that he's made a terrible mistake doesn't erase the consequences of his actions. The film suggests that some violations can't be undone, that manufactured consent poisons everything it touches, that the easy path to getting what you want often leads somewhere much darker than anticipated. Visual storytelling and memorable imagery. Barker demonstrates sophisticated visual storytelling throughout Obsession, creating memorable images that linger in the mind long after viewing. The film employs mirrors and reflections extensively, suggesting the split between Nikki's authentic self and her possessed state. Several key scenes feature her reflection behaving slightly differently than her physical body, a subtle effect that creates unease without calling explicit attention to itself. The One Wish willow itself becomes a recurring visual motif, its broken halves representing the fractured reality Bear has created. The production design gives the object a specific, tactile quality. It looks cheap enough to be a novelty store purchase but just distinctive enough to feel plausibly magical. This balance between mundane and mystical reinforces the film's central conceit. Certain sequences employ more expressionistic visuals to convey subjective experience. When Bear realizes the full extent of what he's done, the film briefly adopts a more surreal aesthetic, with the world seeming to close in around him. These moments of heightened style punctuate the otherwise naturalistic approach without feeling jarring or out of place. The violence, when it comes, is staged with visceral impact. Barker doesn't shy away from showing consequences, but neither does he indulge in gratuitous gore. The film's most disturbing moments often happen just off-screen or in shadows, trusting the audience's imagination to fill in the horrific details. This restraint makes the explicitly violent moments hit harder by contrast. Contextualizing within contemporary horror, Obsession arrives at an interesting moment for horror cinema, as the genre enjoys both critical respectability and commercial success. Films like Get Out, Hereditary, The Witch, and Midsommar have demonstrated that horror can serve as a vehicle for ambitious filmmaking and social commentary while still delivering genre satisfactions. Barker's film fits comfortably within this landscape of elevated horror, though that term itself has become somewhat contentious among genre enthusiasts who argue it implies that traditional horror is somehow less valuable. Obsession works both as smart commentary and visceral entertainment, refusing to choose between intellectual engagement and emotional impact. The film also participates in contemporary horror's interest in relationship dynamics and social anxiety. Recent years have seen numerous horror films exploring toxic relationships, The Invisible Man, family dysfunction, hereditary, romantic betrayal, men, and social isolation, The Lighthouse. Obsession adds to this conversation with its examination of manufactured affection and violated consent. What distinguishes Barker's approach is his willingness to implicate his protagonist in the horror rather than positioning him as a simple victim. This moral complexity aligns with contemporary sensibilities that recognize how privilege, entitlement, and rationalization contribute to problematic behavior. The film refuses easy heroes and villains, instead presenting flawed people whose choices have consequences. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre announcement and future prospects. The recent announcement that Barker will be directing the upcoming reboot of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre initially seemed like cause for concern. That venerable franchise has suffered through numerous failed revival attempts, each more misguided than the last. However, Obsession demonstrates that Barker possesses the technical skill, tonal control, and understanding of horror fundamentals to potentially deliver something worthwhile. What seemed like something to dread now actually inspires hope, at least cautious hope. Barker's ability to find fresh angles on familiar material, his skill with atmosphere and suspense, and his willingness to let sequences build tension slowly rather than relying solely on jump scares suggest he might bring a distinctive vision to the chainsaw mythology. The question remains whether Barker's particular talents, the dark comedy, the relationship dynamics, the supernatural elements, will translate to a franchise. Known for its grimy, brutal, almost documentary-like approach to horror. But ambitious filmmakers often surprise us, and the move from a supernatural relationship thriller to a slasher franchise reboot isn't as strange as it might initially seem. Both require understanding of pacing, suspense, violence, and how to make audiences care about imperiled characters. For now, Obsession stands as proof of concept that Curry Barker is a filmmaker with vision, technical skill, and the ability to deliver both genre satisfactions and thematic substance. Whether he can bring those same qualities to an established franchise remains to be seen, but Obsession makes the prospect considerably less worrying than it would have been otherwise. Critical reception and audience response. Early critical response to Obsession has been largely positive, with reviewers praising its fresh take on familiar material, strong performances, particularly Navarrette's, and Barker's confident direction. The film currently holds strong ratings on review aggregation sites, suggesting both critical and audience appreciation. Horror publications have particularly embraced the film, recognizing it as the kind of intelligent genre filmmaking that demonstrates horror's continued vitality. Mainstream critics have likewise responded positively, with many noting how the supernatural premise serves as an effective metaphor for real-world relationship dynamics. Audience reactions have been similarly enthusiastic, particularly among younger viewers who connect with the film's exploration of modern relationship anxieties. Social media response has highlighted specific sequences and moments, with Navarrette's performance generating considerable discussion and praise. The film has inspired analysis and debate about its themes, always a positive sign that it's connecting beyond simple entertainment. Some criticism has focused on the film's length and occasional pacing issues, valid concerns that suggest Barker's next projects might benefit from more aggressive editing. A few reviewers have found the dark comedy elements tonally inconsistent with the horror, though this seems to be a minority opinion. Overall, the response suggests that Barker has delivered a film that works both as crowd-pleasing entertainment and as a more thoughtful examination of desire and consent. Obsession represents exactly the kind of horror filmmaking that should be celebrated and supported. Ambitious, intelligent, thematically engaged, but never forgetting to deliver genuine scares and suspense. Curry Barker announces himself as a filmmaker with a distinctive voice and the technical skills to realize his vision effectively. The film's greatest strength lies in its refusal to settle for simple answers or comfortable resolutions. By making its protagonist complicit in the horror that befalls him, Obsession challenges viewers to consider how desire can lead to violation, how good intentions don't excuse harmful actions, and how we rationalize behavior we know is wrong. These aren't comfortable themes, but horror has always been most effective when it makes us confront uncomfortable truths. Inde Navarrette's revelatory performance ensures that Obsession will be remembered beyond its theatrical run, creating an iconic possessed character who ranks alongside the genre's most memorable creations. Her work elevates the entire film, providing an emotional anchor that makes the supernatural premise resonate on a deeply human level. For viewers seeking horror that delivers both visceral thrills and thematic substance, Obsession represents exactly what the genre can achieve when talented filmmakers commit fully to their vision. It's a film that will reward multiple viewings, revealing new layers and details that might not be apparent during the first, more viscerally reactive experience. As a calling card for Curry Barker's talent and potential, Obsession succeeds completely, suggesting that whatever he tackles next, whether original material or franchise revival, will be worth watching. The horror genre continues to provide opportunities for fresh voices and distinctive visions, and Barker has firmly established himself as a filmmaker who deserves to be part of that conversation. In the end, Obsession reminds us that the best horror films don't just scare us, they make us think, feel, and question. They hold up mirrors to our own behavior, our desires, our capacity for rationalization and harm. They demonstrate that sometimes the real horror isn't supernatural at all but lies in the very human choices we make and the consequences we unleash. For delivering that kind of experience with style, intelligence, and undeniable craft, Obsession stands as one of the year's horror highlights and announces Curry Barker as a major talent to watch.